Well, good morning. Albert does owe a little bit more money to Fuller, and we're going to work that out later. I checked between services, and his account is a little, lower than it could be. No, not really. It's really, this is a great gift to me and an honor to be here. I have often worshiped here, and I love this congregation. I love what's happening in this church. I think it is an amazing expression of the faithfulness of God, and especially in a new day and in a new way. A church that's committed to being a multi-ethnic church alone is a distinct fact in the United States. There are so few genuinely multi-ethnic churches, and yet we live in a multi-ethnic world, a multi-generational church. Likewise, often many churches are increasingly, sometimes through default, have become almost generationally isolated. This church is really seeking to do something very distinct that's deeply needed in the world and in this region of the United States, in Los Angeles, in this area. So I am so thankful, and I'm so thankful for Albert, for the friendship, for the ministry of this congregation, and many different people that I know, partly through people that Fuller, who are regular parts of the life of this church, and partly through just other people that I've had opportunity to become acquainted with. I'm so thankful for what God's doing. And I'm grateful for the chance to be here today, because I do feel a very deep sense of God doing something and bringing together the particular text that I want us to think about and the circumstances of our nation as we turn to a text in a minute that I think is really like a knife that's meant to be surgical, a knife that's meant to be for life, not against life, a knife that's meant to cut in a way that could actually restore life. Lord, by your grace, today we're going to turn to a text that is just so awkward. It's awkward because what it offers us is a word that Israel didn't really want to receive, and that often the church has not wanted to receive either. And yet it's a word that's given by the prophet Isaiah as a word of life to us. So may we have ears to hear. And even more than ears to hear, may we have ears to hear that then leads to lives that actually live what your word instructs. In Jesus' name. Isaiah 58 says this: "Shout out, do not hold back. Lift up your voice like a trumpet. Announce to my people their rebellion, to the house of Jacob their sins. Yet day after day they seek me and delight to know my ways, as if they were a nation that practiced righteousness and did not forsake the ordinance of their God. They ask of me righteous judgments. They delight to draw near to God. Why do we fast, they complain, but you do not see? Why humble ourselves, but you, O God, do not notice? Look, you serve your own interest on your fast day and oppress all your workers. Look, you fast only to quarrel and to fight and to strike with a wicked fist. Such fasting as you do today will not make your voice heard on high. Is such the fast that I choose? A day to humble oneself? Is it to bow down the head like a bulrush and to lie in sackcloth and ashes? Why will you call this a fast, a day acceptable to the Lord? Is not this an unexpected news to loose the bonds of injustice, to undo the thongs of the yoke, and to let the oppressed go free, and to break every yoke? Is it not to share your bread with the hungry and to bring the homeless poor into your house? When you see the naked, to cover them and not to hide yourself from your own kin? Then your light shall break forth like the dawn, and your healing shall spring up quickly. Your vindicators shall go before you, and the glory of the Lord will be your rear guard. Then you shall call, and the Lord will answer. You shall cry for help, and he will say, here I am." This text is really about a crisis at the very core of Israel's life. If Israel was confident about anything, it was confident about its worship. After all, remember, God had revealed his name, he'd revealed his identity, he'd revealed the law. He'd instructed Israel how they were supposed to live and what it was that they were supposed to do with their worship. He gave them every possible gift, ultimately including even a temple, a special building with special ritual and special vessels that were used as the sign of how to demonstrate that Israel had its worship right. You can imagine, it's like the very, 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 very best day at Fellowship Monrovia every day for Israel. That was sort of the image. They had everything that they had going for them. It was going to be the best possible worship today. Except that God comes along and looks at that narrative and says, I hate your worship. It's really hard for us to actually understand how bizarre this must have been. The God who had given Israel every instruction. Now, see, you must mean, God, that you hate our neighbors' worship. Remember, they're the pagans. They're the people who worship idols. No, see, we worship you. So you've got to find us good and righteous. And God looks at Israel and says, you are so not good and so not righteous. And what makes it even worse is that all of this emerges out of a pretense of worship rather than out of the reality of worship. See, the whole assumption about worship in the Bible is that worship is work. Worship is a work of transformation. It's a work of realignment. Worship is desperately needed because we're confused. We only see partial views of the truth. We only see through our own particular social angle. We don't actually have a clear picture of who God is. We walk in a world of darkness. We are told all kinds of lies of our own making and the making of our families and our educational system and the sociology that surrounds us. All of these things distort us, and we come into corporate worship in order to get our hearts and minds straight again. Who's God? And worship, faithful worship, says to us every time, well, it turns out it's not you. Let's be very clear about that. And yet, every day in our lives, our culture says to us, no, it's really about you, right? It's really about what you want, about what you desire, about what you need, about what you feel, about what your appetites are for. Life is really about you. And Christian worship challenges all of that and says, wait, this is a crisis. Let's get clear. You're not God, and I'm not God, and we're not God. And then, getting that piece clear then says, now what are the implications of living in a world where every day the lies that we internalize, the practices that we fail to keep and also demonstrate, portray a false image of the God that we claim to worship. But worship is meant to recreate us so that how we live and how we love and what we do in the world is a mirror of the love and mercy and justice of God. This is the work of worship. We faithfully worship in the gathering so that when we scatter in the world, we demonstrate the reality of God in the world. That's a biblical vision of worship. It's about what happens here in order to live what happens there. And in this text, what is happening is that God is basically saying to Israel, oh, you gather in my name. In fact, day by day, you cry out to me. You do it even as if you were people who actually practice righteousness, as though what's going to happen here when you call upon my righteous name is actually going to have any stake or claim on you. But you do it as an act of pretense. You cry out to me as if you were a nation that practiced righteousness, Isaiah says. As though what you claim about me and about yourselves actually shows up in the real world, but it just turns out it doesn't. So you whine and you can cry out to me and you say, why don't you answer my prayers, God? Why don't you actually show up and deliver and do the good things that you do? Well, let me tell you what I think of your prayers. They're about you. Your prayers are about you. They're about your interests, your obsessions, your desires, your need, your location, your preoccupations, your fears, your anxieties. All of that I know and I love, but it's not what worship is about. It's about how all that is meant to be recalibrated by being placed in the reality of God's own vision and heart. And it's about how that God then rewrites righteousness in our hearts and our minds, reformulates our capacity to see the world, not through the blindness of our own cultural lens and our own sociology, but through the lens of a God who sees and understands the whole, a God of genuine righteousness and love and mercy. So do you think I have a stake in your fasting? Get over it. Like, why would I find your fasting important if it doesn't lead to a life that looks like my life? If you practice a form of fasting that's really in the end really only about you, then your fasting is bankrupt. Is this not the fast that I choose, God says? And he goes on in the second half of this text to say, this is the fast that I choose. A fast that actually demonstrates the love and righteousness of God, that sees the world through my lens, my vision of the dignity and value of every person. Especially attentive to the most vulnerable, especially attentive to the people that no one else is paying attention to, especially attentive to the people who are unseen, unrecognized, under-recognized, rejected. Those are the people that I'm saying, now, do you show up for people like that? Well, then you begin to demonstrate that you actually are worshiping me, because that's actually who I am. So don't claim to be people of worship and then bark to me your complaint that I don't answer your prayers, when in fact your whole exercise of worship is bankrupt at the core, because it's really mostly about you. Now, I have to say, friends, in a time of American consumer Christianity, where worship is often one of the most consumed products of the Christian church, where the ecclesiastical industrial complex spews out services, music, instrumentation, ornamentation, lighting, videos, yada, yada, yada. It can all become this super gigantic worship thing. But is it really about God? Is it really about how a community of people are going to become like the God that we claim to worship? Or in the end, is it really about salving our desires, making sure that our appetites, our need for solace, our need for security, our need for safety is guarded? A domesticating vision of God. A God that just says not much more ever than, there, all will be well. We need to hear that all will be well. But the way that all will be well is by God first waking us up to the reality of a new kingdom. And it's in moving in that direction that the offense of the gospel, the shock of the gospel, the knife of this text lands. Do you hear it? Don't practice as if worship. Don't say my name with no interest in who I am. Don't say that you worship me or that you love me when you have no interest in knowing me or following me. Don't create a life built on the superficiality of worship practices without any interest in demonstrating and living out the reality of the core of what the gospel is really about. Now, this is a crisis for Israel. Imagine the shock for Israel to be told that it's their worship that God dislikes. Why? Because their ethics doesn't look like God. They have no concern for justice. Their way of living out a reordered power because of the character of God doesn't show up in the way that Israel lives every day. It's how they abuse the people that are around them. It's how they offend them. It's what they do that's going to be a problem to them in the neighborhood. It's how they treat the people who are their servants. It's about what happens in the offices and the workplaces. It's about the way in which power is abused and lives are abused. In the context of all that, it shows the bankruptcy of their worship because it doesn't show up in ways that actually enact the life of God. Jesus, of course, comes along and makes this point over and over and over again. This is why, in fact, in the Sermon on the Mount, so powerfully, he demonstrates and says, this is what life in the kingdom is. It's going to reorder every relationship. It's going to cause you to have to reconsider yourself and what matters and what doesn't matter. And it's going to reorder power, and it's going to reorder your sense of allegiance. It's going to cause you to actually come to know that we follow an enemy-loving God. We follow an enemy-loving God who says to us, it's not a big deal if you love those who love you. Even the Gentiles can do that. No big deal there. The question is, do you love people who don't like you? Do you love people who are not like you? And do you love people who are even your enemies? This is completely different stuff. Where do we get the resources for that? Worship. That's where worship, the work of understanding who God is, what God is about, what the priorities of the kingdom are about, are meant to reorder everything. And in light of everything being reordered, we then live in a new way in the world. Now, the crisis of this weekend, the crisis of Charlottesville, is a crisis of worship. And it's a crisis of worship not just for those who might earn the title white nationalists or even white supremacists. It's really a crisis of worship that permeates, I would argue, really a great deal of the white church in America. And it does so because of disordered love and disordered power. Because in fact, so much of the white church has really always been about itself. It's exactly the critique of this text. 400 years ago, in the middle of the 15th century, a whole pattern of thought began to emerge that claimed this, that if, as discovery went on around the world, There was an opportunity to go to some place, you would investigate whether there were Christians there. And if there weren't Christians there, then you would proclaim it part of the kingdom of Spain or the kingdom of some other nation. And in the context of doing that, you had the right to import everything about your own political forces and power, but also the Christian gospel as a form of really subjugating everyone to the Christian faith. The doctrine of discovery is the backbone of so much of what has happened in the United States and really, frankly, around the world. And it's done in this bizarre and distorted way so that everywhere that discoverers went, they wouldn't find Christians, and then they would say, well, then you belong to us, and your land belongs to us, and we're going to teach you the way of truth. And some of that, you can imagine, would be so nicely appealing to an evangelistic sense of the need for the gospel in the world, but it's also perversely tied to white supremacy, to white domination, to white culture, to a Europeanization of the world, to a sense that over and over again, that's what happens. And that is certainly embedded in the narrative of the United States. So as the United States begins to be discovered, the doctrine of discovery predates it. And then as the nation unfolds, it was just so natural that first Native Americans could be under the doctrine of discovery. And then Africans brought as slaves could be under the doctrine of discovery. And then later, Latinos could be under the doctrine of discovery. And still later, Asians could be under the doctrine of discovery. And it was all under this rubric that suggested that really white culture, white church, white religion was really the thing that held the truth and to which everyone else must somehow find their allegiance. This establishes the cultural, sociological dynamics that then we've been living with ever since. And so much of the white church in America is still built to this very day on the opportunism of the vestiges of the doctrine of discovery and the way that it subjugates and destroys others' lives. That is a worship crisis at the core of the church in many places in the world, and especially in the United States. On this weekend, I wish it was possible to say, as long as we deal with, as it were, the white nationalists, the problem will go away. Thank God I'm not a white nationalist. Or I could try to get myself out of even further, even more than that, I'm not a white supremacist. Okay, I think I'm neither of those things. But am I a white guy who gets the opportunity and privileges of being a white, tall, educated male in a context like this, where seamlessly my social location just becomes something I call normal. And then in the name of my normalcy, I try to make sure that everyone responds to my standard. And it's subtle, and it's not subtle, and it's toxic, and it's destructive. And friends, that is everywhere. And it's not everywhere in the sense that it's conscious racism. It's everywhere because it's built in structure that always prejudices itself in my favor. And if I wasn't a follower of Jesus, I could just say, lucky me. But if I'm a follower of Jesus and I take a text like Isaiah 58 seriously, and I read the Gospels and I take the ministry of Jesus seriously, and I read Paul's letters and I take those seriously, and I say, I want to be an earnest follower, I want to be a faithful worshiper, then in light of Isaiah 58, then my faithful worship will recalibrate everything about my social identity, everything about my use of power, everything about my understanding of my location, everything about how I take responsibility for the way that I use my race in ways that are abusive to other people or opportunistically for my own gain. All of that is called into question because of a God who asks me to worship. Come and worship. But if we're called to worship, then it's going to require that we be transformed, that it actually reorders everything about how we see and everything about how we act. The crisis of Isaiah 58 in the first part is self-interest. When we just continue to live as self-interestedly as we did before we knew God, and now we just perpetuate that and try to do that in God's name. I'm sure Jesus would want to bless me because Jesus surely would be prejudiced in my favor. He would want the world the way that I want the world, and now I'm just going to live the same life that I did before I was a Christian, and now I'm going to try to ask Jesus to bless me in that life that I want to live anyway. There's a lot of that. There's a lot of that. Our culture, including our Christian culture, fosters that sort of self-interest. I sometimes think in our worship songs, it's a meaningful thing to pray and sing using individual pronouns that Jesus or God wants to give me a certain something. That's a legitimate affirmation, that's true. But I also think in a context like this, in this church in particular, it'd be great to at least consider in many songs just purging all individual pronouns and saying, no, what is God doing for us? For we, the communion of God's people. And if we can't make it we, or if it's only about me, then in some sort of sense, I've fallen prey to the indictment again of Isaiah 58. One time I was preaching at an event that had such bright lights on the stage that I could really see almost no one that I was talking to. What I could see was a really bright video monitor here that had an image of me. And then on the other side of the stage, there was another really large video monitor that had another image of me. And then, of course, there was me. So there was me and me and me. This is sort of the postmodern trinity. This is the world I was always waiting for, where everyone and everything would have a serious stake in me, in what I want, what I desire, what I imagine, what I hope for. Everybody's fully engaged, fully present, and in full agreement. Wow, that's the world I want. Except that world is called an illusion. And the gift of the gospel is being delivered from the illusion that I'm at the center of it. So what does worship say? You're not God and I'm not God. God is God. And there is only one center. And that center will hold in the face of injustice and abuse and racism and white supremacy and white nationalism. That center holds because I'm not in charge and neither are you. The one who's in charge is the God who redeems us, the God who saves us, the God who does guard us and protect us and deliver us, but also the God who wants to transform us, to change us, to enlarge us, to give us a deeper heart, a wider mind, a greater capacity to love. That's the nature of the God that we worship. And in that worship, then this little paradigm, this little postmodern trinity, fortunately, by God's grace, gets blown up. And yet the culture that you and I live in every day is a culture that gives us, about 50,000 messages every day that says, no, it's about you. It actually is about you, right? It's about you. It's about what you want. It's about what your stomachs are beginning to growl in anticipation for a little later in the day. It's about what you hope and desire for today. It's about how your hopes and wishes are going to be fulfilled. And there's a legitimacy to the identity and dignity of those things. But they can all be so self-serving and so twisted in upon itself that really we lose our identity and we lose the sense that God is delivering us from ourselves. We will never come to the questions of how a new sociology is being defined by the kingdom of God, a new racial reality, a new humanity in the language that Paul uses in Ephesians 2. We'll never get there if we can't in some way get beyond ourselves. And if we can't get beyond ourselves, then we are still locked in the dark little dungeon of our own ego, as Malcolm Muggeridge says, bounded north, south, east, and west by Mark. What a small and pathetic little world. Years ago, I read an article in the Wall Street Journal about the growing popularity of private jet travel. It was about how in a post-9/11 world, people find it, problematic to fly and blah, blah, blah. And it focused in on this one widget maker who had become a gazillionaire, and the gazillionaire had the opportunity to fly privately. And he explained to us how this turning point came. He said, one day I was flying from one coast to the other, and there was a woman with a baby that was crying all the way across the country, and I decided, that's it, I'm never flying commercial again. And then he gave us his mission statement, and this was it. Because, quote, I've decided that the really important thing to me is to exclude from my life anything that might bum me out. Okay, let's just kind of meditate on that for just a moment. It's a kind of cultural mantra. Let's just let it wash over us again, okay? Because I've decided that the really important thing to me is to exclude from my life anything that might bum me out. Now, when I first read this, I thought, that is just disgusting. And then I thought, that's awkwardly familiar. Now, I don't practice it at quite the elite level that he does. This doesn't lead me to private jet travel. But it does explain why I love having caller ID on my phone. I love being able to just not answer, thank you very much. So seamlessly and visibly excluding from my life something that might bum me out. It does explain many other decisions that I make in my life, because sociology allows me that, especially if I'm a tall, white, educated guy. I can make decisions for exclusion and no one even thinks otherwise. And that wouldn't matter again unless I was a follower of Jesus, who says to me, what are you doing? How can you do that and fail to understand that that means that you are, in so many of those small and big ways, showing a life that doesn't look at all like the life that I've created you for? You're opting for myopia. You're opting for your small little personal terrain. You're opting for the kingdom of Mark, not for the kingdom of God. The sorrow of this weekend is a sorrow that brings us face to face with the way that lies are at the core of a lot of the practices of the American church. Practices in a land of opportunity which have been used especially by white churches and white Christians to justify anything that will defend and protect our whiteness. And it is ironic that Paul, who says so clearly that God is up to something else, is not really heard in the way that it needs to be heard, in a way that I think reflects the priorities of Isaiah 58. You remember in Ephesians 1, Paul says, really, you're dead in your trespasses. You're lost to God, and you're lost to yourselves, and you're lost to the world. But then, thanks be to God, in Jesus Christ, you've been made alive because of the resurrection. And then what's the evidence that you've been made alive? That you now live in a new and unexpected community. An unexpected community of people from every tribe and tongue and nation, and people who are like you and unlike you, who are both Jew and Gentile and male and female and free and slave. You now live in a new humanity, and it's that new humanity that tells the world that this is all about the gospel. So how ironic that the doctrine of discovery, in its insidiousness at the very core of the foundations of so much of the practice of Christianity in America, has actually dismantled that whole paradigm and said, no, what it's really about is homogeneity. What it's really about is whiteness. What it's really about is white culture. What it really is about is people being like me. And the very thing that's meant to be a witness to the church and to the world that Jesus Christ has risen from the dead is cut off right at the beginning. One of the many reasons I'm thankful for this church is that at your beginning, you're trying to do a major reset. You're saying to yourselves as a church, we are a multi-ethnic church. And your worship is multi-ethnic worship. And the question will continue to be as your life unfolds, will it ever more deeply seep all the way into the core of your lives? Will your lives become truly multi-ethnic? Will your vision of the world become a multi-ethnic vision? Will it become a messier reality that you actually are seeing, not a neat and tidy one? Will you allow the gospel to lead you into unexpected relationships, unexpected conversations, unexpected moments of confession, unexpected moments of sorrow, unexpected moments of change? Or will you just sort of like, as it were, in that way that we living in LA often like, the coolness of proximate diversity, but not intimate diversity? That would be tragic. God is giving to you as a church an amazing opportunity, a privilege that you can actually experiment. But friends, there's not a lot of models, and it's not just being in the same room, and it's not just sharing in the same service. It's going to be allowing the worship of the service to be one that propels you in a new way into a new kind of social engagement with each other and also with the people that you touch. The evidence of whether Fellowship Monrovia's worship is faithful is going to be demonstrated by what happens in your homes and your offices and your schools and your neighborhoods. Is Fellowship Monrovia's worship showing up there? Is it changing how those realities are expressed? And is it being nurtured by what happens in the service, but also in the life groups? Is it the case that you're going to study the book of Daniel, which could not be a better book to be studying at this particular moment in our national life, to ask, what does it mean to be strangers in a strange land, to show up with a counter narrative to the narrative of a dominating force and a loud voice? Where will you show up to be people who live alternatively in that context? That is why this church matters so much. Friends, may it be so that your worship here and the worship as you leave this place is a demonstration of the God that we claim to know and follow. And then our worship will be faithful. Lord, may it be by your power that something happens here, both because of what has already happened that has established this church and created its life and opened up so many remarkable doors and opportunities. May it be that your love just continues to move ever more deeply so that Fellowship Monrovia is not representationally diverse, but organically diverse. The very core of its life, heart knit to heart, mind knit to mind, life knit to life, because of Jesus Christ. Lord, I'm so thankful for the vision of this church. It is a faithful vision. It's a risk-taking vision. It will be a hard vision to live out, and it is desperately needed. It will not be in the competencies of the many people in this room that will accomplish it. It will be accomplished because of your Spirit's power. And it will be accomplished by their readiness to open themselves and to allow that power to actually reorder everything so that their life is more and more a demonstration of your unexpected love. Lord, deliver us from as-if worship. Lead us into worship that matters because it shows up in how we actually live. We ask this in Jesus' name.